The Inspired Pilot Podcast, episode 14.
Don't concentrate on your mistakes. Just move on, let it go, and put the bad landings behind you.
Inspiring stories from inspiring pilots from around the world. Welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast with your host, Marvin Robinson.
Okay, welcome to the Inspired Pilot Podcast. This is Marvin Robinson, and I'm delighted to introduce today's featured inspiring pilot, 𝗘𝗏𝗄𝗏 McCullough. Welcome to the show, 𝗘𝗏𝗄𝗏. Are you ready to inspire today?
I am, Marvin. That'd be great.
Fantastic. Let's go. At the age of 16, 𝗘𝗏𝗄𝗏 McCullough's flying career choice was not wholly supported by her parents. However, by the end of college, 𝗘𝗏𝗏 had purchased the first airplane, a Cessna 140 taildragger. Over the next few years, a lot of change followed aviation-wise for 𝗘𝗏𝗏, including working as a flight attendant on 𝗘𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 lies in Boise, Idaho. 𝗘𝗽𝗶𝗀𝗀 joined Northwest Airlines in 1981, which was the start of a fantastic 26-year career. Starting on 727s and DC-10s, 𝗘𝗽𝗃 finally retired as a captain on the prestigious Boeing 747. Now retired, 𝗘𝗽𝗃 is following and enjoying her other passion, photography, and also does motivational speaking to at-risk kids and school groups. Okay, I've given our listeners, the Inspired Pilots, just a short introduction, 𝗘𝗽𝗃. Can you take a minute, tell us a little bit about yourself personally, where you're from, and before we jump deeper into your journey, can you give us just a brief overview of what you're doing aviation-wise now?
Sure. I was raised in Dover, Delaware, and my dad died when I was about 8 years old. So my mother went back to school while I lived with my grandparents, and then we moved back to Delaware and then on to Florida when she remarried. The reason that's relevant is that my mom saved all of the VA money from my father's passing for college for my brother and I. So when I decided I wanted to learn how to fly, she said, well, that's great, but not with my money. and and that's why I took a job at the airport as a receptionist to pay for my flying licenses to get my private pilot when I was in high school. And that gave me 20% off my flying lessons. But it also meant I could only take one lesson every 2 weeks because I had to earn enough money first for each lesson. It was fun. I enjoyed it a lot. And the only problem was that I had to review so much every 2 weeks that it took forever. And by the end of high school, I still didn't have my private pilot license. So I went off to college and decided to pursue a science track because I was interested in more complicated things like physics and mathematics. And my mother was not supportive of me continuing to fly. Today, I didn't ever plan to be retired at age 50 either. Now I'm 60. But I got sick and I couldn't get my FAA medical back. And I'd always said that they'd have to shoot me to get me out of the cockpit before I was 60 or now 65. And I guess someone did because it wasn't my choice to retire early. But now I'm enjoying myself so much. I'm glad it happened because between photography and writing and speaking engagements and traveling, I'm enjoying life and I love the way it's progressed.
Wow. I do like that, especially the way you sort of mentioned it there in terms of life progressing, and that's what life is all about. It's like a progression. I'm really looking forward to jumping into your journey later. You sort of touched on it briefly, but every journey does have to start somewhere. So tell us the story of how you first got involved with flying and why you wanted to become a pilot.
As I mentioned, when I was in high school, they were offering an aviation class as a science elective. And my physics teacher was someone who could make any subject interesting, and he was teaching the class. So I knew I'd enjoy it, whatever we were learning. We were going to learn weather and maps and how planes worked and things like that. And I knew it'd be a fantastic class. So when I decided to take it, my parents were anything but thrilled. However, it was just a ground school, so they weren't worried until I got that job at the airport and could finance my pilot licenses. The funny part about it is the only reason I got the job at the airport is my parents wouldn't loan me the money that day, and all my money was in the bank. So after I watched all my friends going up and taking an introductory ride for $20 back then, and coming back and being so excited and jumping up and down, and wow, that's the best thing I've ever done in my life, I finally got tired of watching them have so much fun, and I went inside and started talking to the ladies behind the counter, and they ended up hiring me. So everything worked out for the best. Even though my parents didn't want me to do it, that turned out to be a real positive, because otherwise I don't think I ever would have thought about going on and taking flying lessons.
I love that. It just shows that when there's a resolve, there's a way. And even though they didn't give you the money, you found the way to make that money, and nothing got in your way of getting up in the air, which obviously that was the start of an amazing career, and you're obviously a big part of your life. That's awesome.
It was so fun to go up the first time. I couldn't even believe it. I had no idea how much I'd enjoy it. And the funny part is, back then I was only 16, and my instructor finally wrote in my logbook that student needs to quit counting swimming pools and start concentrating on learning to fly.
Excellent. I didn't realize there were so many swimming pools in the UK until I started flying. So we don't have the weather normally for it. But yeah.
That's what impressed me too. And once I was up in the air, I was hooked. I didn't think about doing it for a living, but I knew I wanted to keep flying. And I never planned on being an airline pilot because I didn't know that there were female airline pilots. But as I progressed in the field, people started saying, wow, you should be an airline pilot. And I kept saying, my eyes aren't 20/20, they won't hire me. That's why I couldn't go military with my flying career. So again, things worked out because by 1981, the airlines were starting to have a little bit of a pilot shortage, and they were dropping their eye requirement somewhat. So it was 2070 when I was hired.
Okay, that's going to be the J. Let's touch on a few of the other subjects first. So let's look at challenges. So obviously you are an accomplished pilot now. You've had an amazing journey. I've touched on a couple of the things in your bio there. And obviously you retired as a 747 pilot. But let's take it back, if you do remember, back to those teenage years when you were actually learning or studying for your PPL. What did you find challenging during your initial training, and how did you overcome that?
Well, as I mentioned, the most challenging thing to me was having my lessons spaced so far apart, because I had to do mostly review for a lot of the lesson. But the other thing that was challenging is that I had a female instructor, and she was a screamer. She would come in yelling at all the other students, even the VA guys, and she'd yell at me, and we didn't get along right off the bat. And so I switched instructors to a man who was much calmer and much easier to be with. So that was one of my initial challenges.
Forget the screamer instructors and go with the calmer one. Is that your initial advice there?
There you go. It always works when you don't get along well with someone. It's not necessarily you. Just try someone else and see if it'll work better. And as I progressed through my flying career, I had quite a few captains that didn't want women in the cockpit. And they were pretty unpleasant to fly with. And I thought back a lot of times to my initial instructor. And no matter what they did, they couldn't ruin my love for flying, because I guess I always decided it was maybe their problem. Even though it sloughed off on me somewhat, it didn't stop me or slow me down, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, totally. And I think as well, you've touched on that there, and I've heard that a few times now, where especially during the learning phase, and everyone learns differently. We're human beings, we are all different people. And just because you don't get on well with a particular instructor, that's not the end of the world. You, like you say, you made a decision, you switched instructors and you got on better, and that worked better for you. Maybe someone else might like that screamer, that needs to keep them on their toes.
Exactly.
But there's definitely a beautiful relationship between student and instructor out there somewhere. So yeah, nice one. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Let's touch on aircraft types. So how many different aircraft types have you flown, and what aircraft do you hold the closest to your heart, and why?
At one point for my Forest Service part of my career, I had to break down all the airplanes, and there were over 50 types that I'd flown. Wow. And I couldn't list them all for you, even if you wanted me to, but I loved the Cessna 140 the best because it was such a challenge with the tail dragging. And I love the 747. So between those two, we're going in a huge range of gross weights. But those are my two favorites, the smallest and the biggest.
Wow, I like that. So, I think you just mentioned that, it was quite a challenge on the Cessna 140. That was your first aircraft that you purchased, right?
Yes, I had a chance to buy it for $3,000, which was the same cost of a small car back then. And the VA had not given me enough money that term for school. So they sent me a back check, and I just took it and went out and bought an airplane with it.
As you
So
do.
that's $3,000 airplane. And the thing that's so fun about the tail dragging is that once you start learning wheel landings, I would go out and I would practice on a calm day, and I would come in and I would put the left wheel on the center line and drive all the way down the runway on the left wheel. And then I'd take off again. I'd come back around, I'd land, and I'd use the right wheel and keep it on center line all the way down the runway. And that's just how I practiced when I had calm winds until they picked up. And then I started doing the real landings with crosswinds.
Wow. The uneducated might call that showing off, but like you just mentioned, that is obviously the technique for crosswind landing. So, wow, that's a really great story. I love that.
There weren't many people around to show off for, so that was okay too.
And obviously we'll touch on this later, but the Boeing 747, why was that close to your heart? Why was that a great aircraft for you?
I think people don't realize that with those pod engines out there by the wingtips, it's quite a challenge to land that airplane in crosswinds also. And if you get to wobbling at all, you will catch a pod, millions of dollars in a split second. And I absolutely loved flying that airplane with maximum crosswind at 650,000 pounds, which was maximum gross weight. Max crosswind was 30. And then a lot of times going into Anchorage at the end of my career, there was an icy runway and you'd been up most of the night. And it's just the kind of airplane that when you walk away from it after bringing it in, you look back at it and it's so huge and you go, wow, I did that. And I didn't just fly that on a VFR calm day. I brought it in when conditions were horrible. And it's just that kind of a pride or good feeling of accomplishment that I don't know what else I do that gives me that feeling.
Wow. I'm smiling now. It makes me feel very happy that the fact that you were flying a Boeing 747 obviously means you are an accomplished pilot. The airline trusts you, you are that pilot. But the fact that you still look back and go, wow, I really like that. I do that with my Cessna 182. I still do that now. And so, wow, the fact that you felt like that with the Boeing 747 as well, that's really nice.
I have to laugh when people say it's just like driving a bus because I don't think so.
Yeah. I think 𝗙𝗵𝗏𝗀𝗃 mentioned that it was like it flying a great big 172, which I thought was quite amusing as well. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, my instructor, when I checked out, told me to remember that it was an old man's airplane and nothing happened too fast on it. And once he said that, I realized it really didn't. And time almost slowed while you were landing it because it was a very nice flying airplane. And it was just so fun to take it across the Pacific or across the Atlantic. And I know people are like, oh, well, it's hours and hours of boredom. Not for me, maybe for some people, but you're always looking ahead. You're always keeping an eye on the weather. You're always weighing your options. There's always something to do. So I guess it's only boring if you're the kind of person that gets bored easily.
Yeah, I guess so, if you're disengaged as well.
Right.
Thank you for that. That's great. Let's touch on your journey now. So I mentioned a couple of things in the bio, and you've obviously started the journey where you were learning to fly at age 16. Can you take us from taking those first lessons, getting your PPL, and where you went on from that?
Sure. It was really expensive, obviously, to learn how to fly. So I waitressed and I pumped gas and I washed airplanes. And as you mentioned, I worked as a flight attendant. And honestly, all those jobs along the way were fun too. I never looked at it as working hard to get my ratings because I don't know. I just enjoyed it. I enjoyed being around airplanes whenever I was at the airport. And even as a flight attendant, you were always out at the airport. So it was perfect. The only job I had that wasn't that involved with aviation was waitressing. And the reason I liked it so much, it kept you busy. So you weren't bored doing it, but you made good tips and you could go out the next day. If you waitressed at night, you could fly all day and practice and learn. So for me, it was perfect.
Definitely a means to an end there.
Yes. And then once I was a flight instructor down in Troutdale, Oregon, which is just outside of Portland, I loved that job too, because teaching people how to fly and watching them when they get that joy in their expression after doing a good landing or even a good turn around a point, there's nothing better. There's nothing more rewarding than watching people get something that they've worked so hard at. And so I really loved that part of my career. But I had a lot of other flight instructors who were just in it for the money as a means to an end. And I just didn't feel like they enjoyed it the way I did. And they kind of poo-pooed me when I wouldn't fly on the 50-knot wind days down at Troutdale, because when it's at the end of the Columbia Gorge and the winds are horrendous. But when you go up in a 50-knot wind, even if it's straight down the runway, your students aren't going to learn anything. And they're going to be so scared by the time they do figure it out that they're not going to die, that they might never come back. So it baffled me that some of the guys were in such a hurry to make money that they didn't consider their student.
Yeah, so it's like a catch-22. It's like, would you want to scare your student just to work? But then, it might come around where they don't want to fly with you. And so you effectively, swings and roundabouts, you will lose a student anyway.
Right. I wouldn't fly on real bumpy days either, because I found a lot of times initially new pilots get sick in turbulence. So if you take them up on some of those hot summer days with the convection and they start feeling bad, they're not going to come back then either. It just was common sense to me that you didn't push it, even if you needed to make the money or wanted to build the time.
I like your approach there. And just sort of stepping back a bit, you're a flight instructor. So was that the end goal, or was this part of your hour building for the airlines? And where did you do your PPL and your CPL ratings to get your CFI ticket?
In the United States, the only way back in the late 70s and early 80s to build flying time really was being a flight instructor if you weren't in the military, because there weren't a lot of commuter airlines back then. And those that there were, you still had to build time to get to. So it was definitely a stepping stone for the airlines. But for me, it wasn't, because I was still under the impression that I couldn't fly for the airlines. I thought maybe I could get a good corporate job someday on a jet, but I didn't expect to get an airline job.
Wow. So that's what you were thinking then. Did you do your PPL and your commercial ratings at the same establishment?
Oh, sorry. No, I didn't. I finished my private pilot license in Colorado while I was going to college.
Yeah.
And then I moved back to Florida and started working on my commercial instrument rating while I was waitressing at night. After I got those, I knew I had to get a multi-engine rating. And that's why I took the job as the flight attendant on the Vickers. The pay wasn't that great, but the tips were from the rock groups. So that paid for my multi-engine rating. And then I needed a flight instructor. So I took a job in a coal mine, analyzing the coal with my microbiology and degree. That's what I ended up getting from college, is a microbiology degree. So I analyzed the coal, and I got to fly to and from the coal mine in the Cessna 206. So that was a win-win situation also.
Oh, what an excuse, eh?
I know, right? Well, honestly, my ex-husband was the pilot for the mine. So he let me fly it to and from the coal mine, and then he'd go fly all day bringing in supplies while I was analyzing the coal.
Another win-win scenario then as well.
Right. But not traditional by any means, and definitely not going to one flight school like 𝗚𝗵𝗆 and plunking down a phenomenal amount of money and almost having to be rich to learn how to fly, because my mom definitely wasn't. If she hadn't saved all that money for me for college, I would have been working my way all the way through college also. And Embry-Riddle is really expensive, but going to an airport and either joining a flying club or taking lessons is really affordable if that is your priority. I didn't spend a lot of money on clothes or makeup or anything else back then. I only spent it on flying.
So like you said, it's about your priorities. And if your priority is flying, then you can make it happen. There's definitely a route there if that is your priority.
It might be circuitous and it may not be the way everyone else does it, but I know for me, working hard to get there instead of having it all given to me paid off in so many ways, because you learn so much as you're doing it.
That's really great. I like that, 𝗏𝗶𝗄𝗏. Okay, so you're a flight instructor now, and what happened next?
Well, while I was flying around Oregon, I had a student who wanted me to fly him to Idaho on business. So I flew him over there, and we got weathered in Boise. And he took an airliner home, and I stayed with the airplane waiting for the weather to clear. And I walked around the ramp and I saw all the Forest Service airplanes on the ramp. And I went into the headquarters and started talking to them. And they said, we're always looking for pilots to fly over forest fires and any number of jobs. So if you put your application in, you'll probably get hired, because we're also looking for women. And if you have the hours, then that looks good to us. So I went home and I filled out the application, and it was 12 pages of unbelievably nitpicky questioning and breaking down all your flying time into tenths of the hour, and for daytime, nighttime, instrument, airplane types, and it all had to match. It all had to be perfect. And that sounds easy, but when you don't look back on your logbook, you don't realize not everything always adds up perfectly. You have mistakes. So it took me 2 weeks to get that application typed and in. And the man I talked to over there, I kept calling him back every week or every 2 weeks to tell him I was still interested. And by the end of the summer, he called me and said, we need a co-pilot for the fire season. Do you still want the job? And of course he knew I did, because I talked to him every week.
Yeah.
But it was worth it. But the guys I was flying with, the flight instructors, some of them, the same guys that thought I was a chicken for not going up in the strong winds or on the real bumpy days, they were kind of upset that I got the job. And yet I said, you guys who filled out the application, none of you filled it out. If you fill it out, you'll probably get the job. You just have to try.
Come on, what kind of conversations were you having with these guys? What were they saying? Like jealousy or thought that you didn't deserve it?
Right. Jealousy back then. And also a lot of the guys were afraid that the females would knock them out of the slots for the airlines. And so they felt that we had an upper hand. So it was definitely jealousy. And I think they felt like it was unfair competition, but they never stopped to realize that the airlines didn't really want to hire women. So they would hire a token every once in a while, but it was like every 100 guys that went through, they would hire a woman.
Yeah, so it was definitely still stacked against you guys. So they still had a better chance than you, for example.
Right. And it was just a perception. And it's hard to get rid of perceptions if people or prejudices. Once people have them, it's pretty hard to convince them that they're wrong. So you just have to kind of laugh and move on, which is what I did. I moved to Boise, Idaho, and started flying for the Forest Service.
And what kind of flying were you doing? You mentioned flying over forest fires. Were you sort of spotting or actually putting out fires? What were you doing?
Oh my gosh, it was so much fun. We were the infrared crew. So we had a King Air and a Merlin that we used to fly over the forest fires. It was all night flying, and we would fly grids, and we would fly as low as possible, even over the mountains, to get good imagery. And the only thing we had back in those days were Doppler radar on the King Air and Omega GPS on the Merlin, and neither of them worked well. So it would take a lot of effort to fly straight lines and a good grid. And then we would take the imagery, the tech would develop it right away. we would fly in low over the forest fire headquarters place in the woods or wherever they were at, and punch the canister out the bottom of the airplane with the imagery in it, just like a bank canister.
Yeah.
And we'd aim for the X on the ground. That
It's a target practice.
Yes. And it was just one of those jobs that was just a blast. It got tedious flying all night.
Yeah.
You had to be plus or minus 10 on your airspeed and on your heading, and your altitude couldn't vary more than 50 feet, but we really needed to keep it tighter than that. And it was all hand flying all night long.
Wow. I love the sound of that crew, the infrared crew. That sounds amazing. And
We think you're pretty amazing.
and the bombs away when you're dropping the imagery off.
The best part was that back in those days, there were a lot of deaths in forest fires from not knowing where the fire was at in the smoke. And when you did infrared over it, you could pinpoint where the hot spots were, which way it was moving. And we saved a lot of lives by not dropping crews in to the heat of the fire.
Exactly. So although it was fun, you guys were actually doing a really fantastic job making a real difference to lives. And it's quite ironic, actually, isn't it? Where, you said dropping crews into the wrong area could mean the death of those crews. And what a great job.
It was critical, and it was a great job. I loved it. I was glad I wasn't going to be flying nights anymore after that, because Northwest hired me to fly for them after that first forest fire season. I got so much time in turboprops in 4 months that I couldn't even log a lot of it, partly because in order to fight the fires, we were going over time and would not only not get paid for it, but we would have been in trouble for flying that many hours.
So was that just a case of everyone just agreeing to do it, or you just had to do what you had to do at that time just to help people, I guess?
We all agreed to it because we could see the acreage burning up underneath us. So we felt like we didn't have a choice. We had to do it because we knew we could.
Wow, that was quite selfless from you guys, and what a good cause.
The shame was we couldn't log the hours, so I don't know how much time I really have.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. It's like the shame of not logging the hours and not getting paid as well. So it's like,
I know, right?
Yeah, I don't know which is worse. So you mentioned joining Northwest Airlines there, but tell us, leading up to that, what were you doing? Were you putting out, you realized you had the hours. Were you out there scouting for airlines? What happened there? Tell us that process of how you moved from the turboprops, the King Airs, and the infrared crew to Northwest.
I was scouting airlines, and my girlfriend at the Forest Service and I were both asked to come interview with 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗃 in California. And that was a pretty prestigious company to be with then, and neither of us had the jet time. So we knew they weren't going to hire us, but they were going to pay for us to go down to California for the weekend and interview us. And we thought it'd be good practice for all the other airlines. So we hopped in the car in Boise, Idaho, and drove to Portland, Oregon, because that's where 𝗟𝗏𝗃 flew out of. And on the way, the reason I'm telling you this is my girlfriend was going down I-84 at 100 miles an hour plus. And I said, Dawn, you are going to get a ticket. She goes, oh, I never get tickets. I always talk my way out of them. And I said, well, here's your chance, because in the rearview mirror, there was a cop, and he pulled us over. And he got out, and he was so mad. He had smoke coming out of his ears. And he said, you ladies had better both have your pilot licenses, or you're getting one hell of a ticket.
Is that what he said? Is that what he said?
Yeah. So we whipped out our licenses so fast you couldn't even believe it. And he just stared at him. And he just started shaking his head. And he goes, I'm going to have to come up with a new line.
Exactly. That is awesome. I'm sure he's used that millions of times before, right?
Right. And here, so he said, all right, I'm letting you off, but with a warning. But if you get caught again today, it's going to be a big ticket.
That is
anyway,
awesome.
We laughed about it, and we went down to California and we interviewed, and they said they wanted to hire us. And we were both at different times, so we compared notes later. And we said, well, we don't have the jet time. And he said, well, come back next week with the jet time. And I was so naive back then. I said, I can't fly 1,000 hours in a week. What they wanted us to do is go home and write our time in, fudge it in.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, and
Come back with the jet time. All right.
the other thing they wanted was a first class medical with no limitations. And they told us that there was a doctor down the street who would take care of, in my case, the eyes and give me a first class medical. And again, I said, I can't do that. I've got an interview with Northwest Airlines next week, and I'm not going to risk it for anything. I can't even imagine having a medical that's basically a lie. They're going to find that out too.
Yeah. What pressures were they on? Was it like we need to get some ladies in, or what was going on there? Why was that okay to them?
We talked about it on the way home, and we think that they did need to hire, but we also think that it could have been a setup. And it just wasn't worth it to us. We'd worked too hard to get that far in our career to lie about it. So we never were sure. But what we heard was that they were having trouble finding people with the jet time. And they even told us, well, a lot of the guys do it. And we just said, well, we're not going to.
I think a lot of things like that, it's like a little lie there. You could be the captain of a Boeing 747 later on, and that kind of thing just shows its ugly head. But wow,
Right.
wow. Well, at least you took the moral high ground there and did the right thing.
I know, right? And we also knew that if we did fly for them, and if anything ever happened, that we would be found out and probably sued or feathered and tarred. I don't know. To me, I just couldn't believe anyone would fake the time to get the job. But apparently, some of them did.
Well, I'm glad you didn't do that and moved on. So you turned your back on 𝗟𝗏𝗀𝗀. Then what?
So the interview with Northwest was really interesting because there were 4 guys in the office interviewing me, and one of them said, well, what's the lowest that you've ever flown an airplane to, an approach to minimums? Well, I had to tell him it was 00 because I had been flying with a captain who told me to stay on the instruments, and I'm not going to tell you where because I don't want to get anybody in trouble.
Good,
But
yeah.
but he told me to keep my eye on the instruments and that he'd let me know when the runway was in sight. And then he said, okay, stay on the instruments. I've got the runway, but stay on the instruments because I don't want you to get disoriented. It's pretty patchy out there. And so he finally said, okay, look up and land. And I looked up and there was the center line and I just plunked it right on. And it turned out we didn't have the visibility to even taxi in. And the tower told us to just stop right there, maintain our position, and they'd get a tug out to bring us all the way into the ramp.
Wow. How did that panel there at Northwest, how did they take that story? Because that's pretty impressive.
They were pretty surprised. I think they still expected girls to cry, or something. They nodded and offered me the job as soon as I went through the 3 days at Mayo Clinic, and I had to fly the simulator, the 727, and show them that I could fly it. And then I was hired.
Excellent. I think as well, that kind of story, you were told by your captain to stay on instruments, so no one could accuse you of being reckless or whatever, or breaking minimums. But the fact that you stayed on instruments and then you landed effectively gave them an insight into your ability on the aircraft anyway.
Right. They knew, I guess they knew I could fly or follow orders. I'm not sure which.
Yeah, take your pick. Which one you choose. Okay, so you're at Northwest now and you are on the 727. What was that like moving onto the jet? This is the real jet time now.
It was so fun. I absolutely loved it because back in the early days, the guys didn't know, we didn't have many women pilots. And so they wanted to see if you really knew how to fly. And they would let you fly every 3rd landing as flight engineer. They would rotate and let you up in this co-pilot seat. And it was just a kick in the pants to fly that airplane.
So these guys are your colleagues and they're like, can she really fly? Is it like that? Or are they just being nice to you? Or are they just like this curious?
Both or all. And then I think that they liked teaching. And so they liked telling you, okay, do this. Okay. They liked watching you get the hang of it. I think that they had been in their position so long since there had been no hiring going on that they were slightly bored and they just wanted to see if the new kid could do it.
And totally, you're going to be the beneficiary of that. So yeah, another win-win scenario. Excellent.
Exactly. And that was before it was such a big deal. In years now, you could get fired or get in big trouble for changing seats. But back then, no one had really made a policy on it. So until Northwest had an accident, and then there were no passengers on board. But after that, we were told no more seat swapping. Period.
Okay. So what happened there? So you're the flight engineer on a Boeing 727. What kind of flying were you doing then? Was that internationally in the 727, or was that just internally?
No, it was mountain flying. A lot of it was from Minneapolis, Minnesota, out to Seattle. And you would jump up and down through the mountain stations. You'd go, it depended where you started. Billings, Butte, Bozeman, Helena. You'd end up Spokane and then Seattle. I think I missed a station, but anyway, it was a lot of legs during the day. So I would get at least 2 landings a day from the guys.
Which is priceless, right? So
yes.
I'm assuming then you can't log that time as yourself, but obviously you had the experience.
Correct. There was no logging that flight time either.
Okay.
But it was good because when I checked out as co-pilot, by that time there was a group in training that didn't want women pilots.
And that's a fact, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden I went from being really accepted as a flight engineer to kind of being harassed as co-pilot or to be co-pilot. So the men that let me fly those legs and helped me in the early days, they don't know how much they really helped me later because it kept my flying skills current and I knew I could fly the airplane thanks to them.
The same guys that were helping you as a flight engineer, albeit out of curiosity and boredom,
Right.
were they actually supporters of you, even though there was a group that didn't want you to be a co-pilot? What was going on there? Was that a case of they didn't believe that you would become a co-pilot, or what?
The men who were captains and let me fly the airplane as an engineer moved on up. I guess you're right. I guess they maybe didn't see me as a threat back then. It was just, let's see if she can fly. But I think that there's always a huge percentage of really nice guys. And then a much, like maybe 10% or 20 of guys that really didn't want the women there. So obviously the ones that let me fly the airplane were the nice guys.
They were the nice ones, yeah.
And I didn't realize it at the time, but the guys that didn't let me fly were the ones that really didn't want me there.
Yeah.
So as co-pilot, I would have a really good month with one captain, and then I'd fly with another captain the next month who was just horrendous. And it was kind of like being on a roller coaster because you'd love your job one month, and then the next month it was a living hell. And then you'd love it again the next month because you can fly with someone who actually can break your confidence. They really work on it and almost set you up. So it's not fun to fly without the camaraderie.
And how did, in that situation where you were having, as you say, a bad month, how did you deal with that personally?
It was pretty hard. I didn't realize I could be so influenced that my flying could even suffer with someone on me all the time. Because even if you're confident, you can lose it if you have someone who knows the airplane that much better than you and kind of knows where your weak spots are.
When you were getting bashed, was it just a case of time and experience? You sort of built yourself up. How did you sort of deal with getting bashed and your confidence getting knocked?
It was hard. I would go to my room at night and I would set my flight bag down. And some nights I'd be so frustrated, I would kick it as hard as I could. And I would say, thank God I'm not married to that blankety blank. Anyway,
Yeah.
No, I tried to make a joke of it. And what I realized is that the guys that were not great to fly with me weren't great to the guys either. They were worse and harder on the females, but the guys had them on their no-fly list too. So they just weren't nice people.
Okay. And I guess in any walk of life, any career, you're going to get those kind of people anyway. So I guess it's just one of those things you just have to sort of take as is and leave it as that.
It is. And I think that today's women, at least the ones I know now, aren't as threatened by that. There aren't as many captains like that. There are always going to be jerks, but there aren't as many now that are anti-women having the job.
I like to think we've moved on from that kind of era anyway.
Yeah. I know one day, though, I was going into Detroit and I was brand new on the 727 and my speed was 260 knots. And I hadn't heard the controller say to slow to 250. And instead of saying, the controller wants you to slow to 250, the captain grabbed a hold of the yoke, yanked it back almost so hard that I'm glad none of the flight attendants were injured, yanked it back to slow it, and then pushed it forward and said, when they want 250, they want 250. And cuss words followed.
Wow. That definitely was a different era. I'm almost certain it's not like that now.
No,
Yeah.
it's not. It's not.
You're a co-pilot now on a Boeing 727. Tell us about the DC-10.
The DC-10 was a fun airplane to fly, even as flight engineer. And part of it was because of the places that I flew it. I almost always went to Hawaii in the DC-10. And a layover in paradise is never a bad layover.
It's tough, isn't it? Life's tough. And layovers in Hawaii.
Yes. So that was the DC-10. And I know there are people that don't like it, but to me, it was just a great airplane. They'd fixed all the glitches on it by then, and they weren't having the issues with the cargo door lights and things like that. And I was looking forward to flying it as co-pilot if it had worked out.
What was the major differences from your point of view? So you've gone from a co-pilot of the 727 to, sort of technically downgrading your status, I guess, to the flight engineer.
Actually, what I did was I flew flight engineer first in the 727, then flight engineer in the DC-10. Then I went back to the 727 to fly co-pilot. And despite the guys that weren't fun to fly with, I swore I would never be flight engineer again because I was having so much fun taking off and landing the airplane all the time. Not just once in a while when I had nice guys, or going through the mountains, but I loved flying. And then I met my husband now, and he lived and farmed in Eastern Oregon. And the only way to live out here, where I'm still at, is to fly longer trips on a bigger airplane. And I had to go back to flying 747 flight engineer to live in the middle of nowhere.
So you sort of took a strategic move to flight engineer from doing all those wonderful takeoff and landings just to sort of facilitate your life, as it were.
Right. And he was going to move to Minneapolis. That was the plan. And then his uncles realized he was leaving, and he was the main worker on the farm. And they said, no, you're not leaving. And they changed things enough that he decided to stay. And I had to move out here if I wanted to stay with him.
Well, I know how much I like taking off and landing. So the fact that you gave that up for your husband, that's got to be love, right?
It had to be, right? We're still married 27 years later. So that's a good thing.
That is a very good thing. And congratulations.
Thanks.
Awesome. So flight engineer on the 747 now. So it sounds a little bit exciting now. So what happened there? What was it like going international on the 747?
It was incredible. And it made up for not being in the co-pilot seat because I had not left the United States very much before. And now I was flying to Amsterdam and London and all over Asia. It was amazing. I'd forgotten how much I loved to travel. I hit the ground running in every city that we were in. And I had plans for every layover. And the captains started saying, well, where are you going now? And they started coming with me because I had all these places to go once we got there.
So you were the corporate tourism clerk.
Exactly. I was the tour guide.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, so you're a flight engineer now. So what was the progression up to before you retired as a captain of the 747?
I've got 2 kids, and what I had to do if I wanted to be home as a mom is stay senior as a flight engineer and a co-pilot. And that's what I did. I made sure that I could hold the best schedules so that I worked only 10 or 11 days of the month. And especially when the kids were little, I just needed to do it for me so that I didn't feel like a bad mom.
Can you just explain that a second? So when you say remaining senior within a role, is that you holding back from potentially getting a promotion to be less senior in a particular role? Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I ran into the same guys again who were really upset at how I was using the system when I should be a co-pilot instead of an engineer, or a captain instead of a co-pilot. And I know that there were plenty of guys that did that, but I think that they liked to kind of goad us. And so they would just get on a track where they would say, what do you think you're doing? Da, 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 da. And they'd be sitting back there so long. And don't you know how much more money you could make up front? And I finally looked at one of them one day and I said, I don't think I could make more money if I were divorced and having to give half of it to my ex like you are.
Ouch, that's going to hurt.
I know, right? And because he was being so mean about it. And it's kind of funny because I said, yes, you can make more money, but if you're not home with your family, what good's it going to do you? Because he was flying 23 days a month. It didn't make sense.
Yeah, it's definitely have to look at the big picture. And obviously you were looking at the bigger picture, and I kind of like those days off. That sounds good.
As a mom, it's kind of funny, but when nature kicks in, at least for me, I had to feel like I was doing a good job. And being a mother was just as important as being a pilot. And I had to make them balance. I had to get the teeter-totter equal.
Yeah. And how was that seen? Obviously, you were sort of working the system, as it were, for your benefit. Obviously, you were a happier mum and around for your kids. Obviously, you were a happier employee. How was this viewed by the sort of the management, as it were?
They honestly didn't care because they needed a body to fill the seat. Okay. And they needed you doing a good job and a safe job. And as long as you were doing that, I didn't get harassed by the management at all. It was just going through training that I ran into that same faction of guys that didn't want women there. And they would make the training as difficult as possible and say that it was because you had sat back in the back too long or sat in the right seat too long. So they did win when it came to training, because there were a lot of bad, I don't even know how to put it, things that were done on me when I was trying to check out.
Okay. Stepping stones and walls built in front of you, I guess.
Right. Well, when you're switching, for example, to co-pilot and the captain won't help you at all and makes you basically fly a 3-person airplane by yourself, it's tough.
Yeah.
And so the setups were tough. But again, when you get through the other side and you realize that you made it, no matter what they did, it's that feeling of accomplishment again.
Talking about that feeling of you made it, how was it when you became a captain? You finished that check ride and you became the captain of the 747. What was that like? Pretty
incredible. And a little bit scary at first. I know the guys I was talking to in Hong Kong one day said it always takes a good year to get really comfortable in a new seat. And they were saying, hey, we were kind of scared at first because it's a big job. It's a big responsibility. And it was nice to hear them say that.
Yeah, they didn't have to say that, did they? But they did.
No, yeah. They didn't. And it's hard. The guys, especially male pilots, have pretty big egos. And so to be that honest and kind, that's pretty nice. It's good to hear.
So in terms of when you made the captaincy, how did that affect your getting home and your flight hours? Were you still able to maintain that lifestyle?
I was, yes. The only base left at that time in our 747 system was up in Anchorage. So I was an Anchorage-based pilot, and my kids were a little bit older, and I didn't feel quite as bad having to leave home a day early to make it to Anchorage, because I didn't ever want to be late for a trip or a no-show for a trip. So one time I went up a day early, and I have no idea why. I just decided the flights maybe didn't look as good the next day or something, because it's all standby. Even though I bought tickets a lot of the time just to make sure I got there. So anyway, I flew up to Anchorage a day early, and the next day there were 70 knot winds and they closed the airport. So I wouldn't have gotten there for my trip. And I don't know, you just take your best guess and get to work on time.
Well, I think your intuition kicked in there and it worked well for you.
Yes, yes. I couldn't maintain quite the schedule as captain, so I was working now 12 or 13 days a month instead of my 10 or 11.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody feels too sorry for me for that.
I'm not feeling sorry for you at all. Okay, so you mentioned that you had some medical issues which obviously cut short your flying career, as it were. How was that for you? Was there a transition period where the realism of it was taking place? How was it for you?
No, I think that's what made it so hard. I was flying into Hong Kong, and my co-pilot it was his leg, so he was flying. And I looked at the chart, the plate for Hong Kong. We were in the clouds, of course, and I couldn't read it. There were blanks in it. All the letters were perfectly clear, but there were holes in the chart. And I had the approach memorized from the simulator that year, because that happened to be our scenario. And I just read all, I just told him the DMEs and when to turn and things like that. But if I'd been going into any other airport and not able to read the chart in the weather, it would have been bad. And I got on the ground and I was like, I don't know what that was about. And then the next week in Seoul, Korea, it happened 2 more times on the ground. And that worried me the most, because I thought, if I were coming in or out of Seoul with North Korea that close, there would be no room for error because I couldn't read an approach plate. So I called my doctor and he set me up for an MRI on the way home. And I got home, and a day or 2 later, I got really sick and I went in for surgery, and it was all related. It was appendix cancer.
Wow.
So, and I was getting visual migraines for some reason with the appendix cancer. And the cancer's gone, but the visual migraines stayed. So that's why I never went back flying.
Okay. Was that an option? Were you still thinking about doing that? I guess you were, right?
Oh, I wanted to. I was only 50 and I loved being captain. and so then, I had people say, well, it's not that bad. Maybe it won't happen again when you're flying. But the FAA told me I couldn't fly. And you already know I was a goody two shoes. I didn't log my P51 time for AirCal or
Yeah, exactly.
So I just had to hang up my hat.
Gosh, emotionally, how did you handle that when you made that decision? Was that, obviously your health is your number one priority, but I can imagine flying, and especially being a captain of a 747, it's part of your identity at that point anyway.
It was the hardest time of my life. On the one hand, I was glad I was still alive because they had to go in and do a right colectomy and everything to make sure the cancer hadn't spread. But on the other hand, you're right. I had never realized how much I identified who I was with what I did. And it was really tough for probably 4 or 5 years.
Based on what you just said there, I guess you've got over that now. Is that correct?
Finally.
Yeah. I was holding my breath then.
Yeah. No, and now I'm really happy, but no, at the time I just couldn't imagine giving up that career. It was just too great of a lifestyle for me. And I really miss my airplane, and I joke about bringing it out to the ranch and landing it, and then at least I'll have a place to go, go take a nap in the bunk or
Yeah, exactly.
sit in my cockpit. But I love that plane.
Oh, so when the FAA decided that you can't fly, was that any flying whatsoever or just commercially?
Any flying, because I was taking a triptan whenever I had a headache come on, but without a warning, the FAA won't let you get your medical back.
They won't take that risk at all, no.
No. And I did. I had people say, well, just lie. And I'm like, no.
Love your journey. I love the way that it ended at a really massive high, Boeing 747 captain. And probably the best high is that although you lost your career, your health is there. And to me, that's probably the best high. And you've got that and you can still live out the rest of your life. And no one else has been affected, basically. So that's always a good thing.
Right. And I look back and 26 years is a good career. And not ever bending metal is even better. No, no accidents or incidents or anything. And I guess I've really come to grips with it and been able to just be happy with what a great career I had.
Fantastic. So of all the things you've done in your flying career so far, Kathy, what has been your proudest flying moment?
I was thinking about that before, and I guess that the part in my career that it's going to be kind of funny to say this, but I turned an airplane down in Hong Kong with the captain, because I was still co-pilot, and an engineer. And we felt it wasn't safe to fly because they had flames coming out of the instrument panel the week before, and they hadn't had time to do a test flight on it. And nothing was right. They had a DC-9 altimeter and a 747. They didn't have paperwork on it. They had all kinds of things still wrong with the airplane, but they wanted us to limp it out of Hong Kong so that they could get their bonus. And we turned it down, and we were in so much trouble that they deadheaded us back to Minneapolis to meet with lawyers and stenographers and fire us.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. And the reason was that the guys who were supposed to get the bonus, the tech ops guys, were so angry at us for not taking this plane that they told the company we had turned it down to go drinking in Hong Kong.
Which obviously wasn't the case, right?
Right. We had a 60-hour layover in Osaka, so there was no reason to drink in Hong Kong on a 120-degree day with the worst smog that they'd ever had. So I guess that the reason this is my proudest moment is we're standing in front of the vice president of flight ops, and he's screaming at us, and he hasn't listened to the captain at all. And he turned to me and said, "Do you have anything to add to this?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I do." And I didn't break eye contact with him, and I just talked to him and said, "Look, this plane was not safe to fly." And I told him why. And something clicked in his head, and he realized that we hadn't done anything wrong. And the 𝗟𝗶𝗶𝗀𝗀 people, that our union people there, said they'd never seen this man change his mind on anything. He hadn't listened while the captain read the air safety report to him, and he hadn't listened at all to the captain. And I don't know why he listened to me, but I was just glad I stood up to him, and it made me realize you can do everything right and still be fired, still be in trouble. And it just was a big confidence building moment for me.
I think as well, you stood your ground there, and I can imagine that guy talking to the captain. He had already made a decision up in his mind, so there was nothing, and obviously he was angry about something, his bonus, etc. But he'd already made up his mind. But obviously talking to you at that moment, he must have just made an emotional connection to you and like, oh my gosh, just realized. And wow, if you hadn't have stood your ground then or said something differently, you would have been out on your ear.
Right. And I wasn't too worried about being out on my ear because I thought, well, then we'll go to the newspapers and we'll just say it was a safety issue. We turned an airplane down for safety and got fired for it. And who's going to buy that? But that's just a path you don't want to take if you don't have to.
Exactly. Call me old-fashioned, but flames coming out the panel, it's not necessarily the best thing.
No. And even when he told us that we weren't going to get written up and we weren't going to get fired, he said, "But you still turned down a perfectly good airplane. It's been flying around for all week." And I said, "Well, your perfectly good airplane still has 3 open maintenance items on it, and it's still illegal." And he looked at his manual revisions guy and said, "Is that true?" And the guy nodded his head. And he looked back at me and said, "Well, you still wouldn't have, the FAA wouldn't have violated you." And my FAA friend told me later, "Oh, yes, we would have, because we can't get through an airline like Northwest. We violate the pilots."
Wow. Well, there you go. Made the right decision there.
Yeah, and I guess, and the only reason I'm hoping that helps some of the listeners is that it's really hard sometimes to make the right decision when everybody's against you doing it.
What do you recommend in that scenario then? Just hold your ground and do what you believe in?
That's what works for me.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. You are retired. You're not flying at the moment, but are you doing anything aviation-wise now? I know you mentioned writing, the mentoring. What are you doing at the moment?
Well, I'm heading to Berlin in 2 weeks with a group of women airline pilots. And we raise scholarship money to help get other women over the hump. We pay for 737 type ratings. We gave away 4 this year to young women who were almost to the airlines, and they just need that extra push. And it's a lot of mentoring and camaraderie. And I realized that even though I'm retired and I'm not flying anymore, just being there to support a lot of these young women who have a full plate with their kids, young kids, and being low seniority in an airline, that I can support them more than I thought.
Yeah, that's awesome. How do you guys generate funds for all these, is it charitable events? How do you generate money for these ratings, etc.?
We do get some donations from some airlines or airline groups, but mostly it's all raised by other women pilots. We either donate it or we have a big auction that we do every year and we fundraise. Honestly, we all chip in. We're just all trying to give back because we know what it was like for us. And everybody needs a leg up sometimes.
A great cause there. I'm sure you've got a lot of grateful pilots in the organization.
The young women who are trying to do it all right now with kids and also a brand new airline job, it's pretty tough because there's no flexibility in the industry yet for women who have kids. So they're still flying a full schedule, and they may not have the option like I did to fly and stay senior. And I keep hoping it'll change, but since it's mostly a male career and also because the airlines have no real reason to do it, we just don't have flex time. We just don't have anything built into the system.
And do you think that system's going to change anytime soon?
Well, we're working on it. I hope it does. And I think Alaska Airlines has already proven to be a really good major carrier who cares about its people and lets the women have the time that they need for maternity leave and things like that. So it only takes one to start. And hopefully the flight attendants can do it. But the pilots, our pilot union, why would they push for that? They're mostly male union. So it's not something that's going to benefit most of their members.
Yeah, it's not as high on the agenda, as it were.
Right. So sometimes just a pat on the back is pretty nice for a lot of these women because they just hearing that someone else has been there and gone through it and come out the other side successfully. It seems to help. I hope it does.
I'm sure it does. So what are your future plans or aspirations? What's the future for Kathy?
I love taking pictures, obviously, and I love speaking. So I'd like to keep speaking and mentoring. But I'm really hoping that a fiction book that I've written takes off because I think it would be really fun to have it. This is going to sound silly, but I think it'd be fun to have it made into a movie. I think it'd be fun to go to Hollywood and watch them make your book into a movie.
Go on, what's the title of the book?
Breakfast in Narita. And Narita's Narita, Japan.
Breakfast in Narita, okay.
It's basically set up around a breakfast group of flight attendant and female pilots that meet in Japan's new Narita airport.
Love that setup there. That sounds really good.
It's turning into more of an action thriller because it's set back in 94, 95. And it's got all this intrigue in it about stowaways in the ceiling of the 747 that really happened. And the Philippine bombing that actually Osama bin Laden had helped finance back then.
Yeah.
And all kinds of things that happened that year. So it's not just a girl novel.
Is this a manuscript now or has it been published?
It's still a manuscript, and I know I can self-publish, but I don't want to self-publish if I don't have to. I'd rather go traditional.
Okay, well, I'm going to watch the space then, all right? And hope you good luck with the publishing and the movie. I wonder who's going to play who.
How's that for just a small aspiration, right?
No, I reckon you got to shoot high. You know more than most, aim for the stars, literally, and go for it. I reckon if you believe in it enough, as you said previously, you can do it.
I'm shooting for it.
Go for it, 𝗂𝗄𝗃. I believe you, all right?
Thanks, Marvin.
No problem. Okay, this is my favorite part of the show, 𝗂𝗃. Welcome to the Quick Fire Checklist. This is where I ask you a series of questions and you come back to us, the inspired pilots, with amazing and inspiring answers. How does that sound? You ready?
Ready.
Excellent, let's go. What is the best piece of advice related to flying that you've ever received?
Don't concentrate on your mistakes. Just move on, let it go, and put the bad landings behind you.
Excellent. Do you have a favorite internet flying resource that you'd like to share with the listeners?
I really love airliners.net because I love the pictures on it. And then I love Carlene's blog, Flight to Success. Those are the two that I probably go to most often.
Great recommendations there. Can you share one of your personal habits that you found useful and believe contributed to your flying success?
Probably being really stubborn and determined and never giving up.
Excellent. Trikes or tail draggers?
Do I have to? Okay, still tail draggers. I love them.
After all those years, yeah?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
I love that. 747 captain tail draggers. Awesome.
I know. Really.
Can you recommend one aviation related book?
Can I pick two?
Because it's you, yes, you can.
Okay, I like Hangar Talk by 𝗟𝗶𝗏𝗀𝗀𝗃. It's just a great compilation of stories. And I love Flying Tigress by Nora O'Neill because she had all the problems that I had, and it just made me laugh because I thought, well, I guess I don't have to write anything now. She's already written it.
Just write ditto underneath, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, Hangar Talk and Flying Tigress. I'll make sure they're linked to in your show notes.
Thanks.
So it'd be interesting to hear if you've got an answer to this. What is your favorite non-essential but essential technology gadget that you had in your cockpit?
You mean since I'm not flying anymore?
Yeah. What did you have when you were flying?
I don't know if I guess it's kind of essential, so maybe this isn't a good answer, but for me, it's GPS because when I started flying, we didn't have it. We had Doppler, we had Omega, but we didn't have good GPS at all. And even in the 1990s, early 90s, we'd get to Japan and we'd be 11 or 12 miles off. And we'd come back to the US and we'd be 17 miles off sometimes. And the controllers would be so angry with us.
Wow, that's a really great insight. And I guess you're right, because a lot of these gadgets in our cockpit now, these are all sort of recent times, aren't they? These are, technology has evolved and, GPS in our hands now, mobile phones, video, there's lots of stuff out there. And these are all relatively new. But getting to the United States and being 70 miles off using the onboard technology of the 747 is quite impressive.
Yeah, not so great. The controllers are not happy with you.
No.
And luckily you call in far enough off the coastline that they correct you,
Yeah.
but you're way off. So good GPS is worth its weight in gold.
Okay, it's my favorite question now. If you had a time machine and could go back in time and meet your younger self, just as you're about to start your flying journey, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give yourself, 𝗂𝗃?
I would tell me to relax more and enjoy the ride. And I would say you're doing a great job.
Fantastic. Okay, Inspired Pilots, you can find all the links to all the resources and everything else we've been talking about in today's episode by going to inspiredpilot.com and search for 𝗂𝗃 in the search bar to find the show notes for this episode. Okay, 𝗂𝗃, listening to your journey and the stories you've shared have been very eye-opening and inspiring to me, and I know the listeners are going to enjoy it too. Can you give the audience of Inspired Pilots one last piece of guidance and then share how people can get in contact with you, and then we'll sign off?
Just don't ever give up on your dreams. Keep striving. And you can get in contact with me right now, probably on my Photodeck account under 𝗂𝗃_McCullough.photodeck.com. I used to have a blog on WordPress, and I haven't written in it for a while because I had problems with a scammer, and I decided to take my internet presence down a bit.
Ouch. Okay. But the listeners can contact you via your Photodeck blog. So I'll make sure that's linked to in your show notes also.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay, 𝗂𝗃, thank you for joining us on the show today, for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. On behalf of the Inspired Pilots, I'd like to say thank you very much and speak to you again.
Thanks, Marvin. You too. Have a good day.
Thank you so much for joining us today on the Inspired Pilot podcast. Don't forget to head over to the show's website, inspiredpilot.com. That's where you'll find the show notes for every episode. You can also leave a comment for our guest, find the links to all the resources mentioned, and much, much more. I really appreciate and love receiving feedback about the show, so do get in touch. I reply to every single email. And if you do like the show, I'd be really grateful if you share it with your friends, colleagues, and fellow Av geeks. And if you do feel inclined, please leave a rating and review on iTunes, as this really does help increase the show's exposure and therefore getting the journeys of our featured inspiring pilots in front of and inspiring more people, which is the whole mission of the podcast. And don't forget, wherever you are on your pilot journey, get ready to be inspired.